Welcome. In this video, I'm going to go through the Jamboard of notes that I took from Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. And this video will review some of the main points from the TED Talk, and hopefully it will help you contribute to the discussion question on Classroom. And that is your graded assignment for the week, responding to that discussion question. All right, so let's review the TED Talk. The TED Talk was called The Danger of a Single Story. And at the start of the talk, Adichie kind of sets up like why she is giving this talk, what her purpose is. She starts by saying she is a storyteller and she wants to tell us some stories about the single story. And the single story will be the focus of her TED Talk. The thesis of her TED Talk is that the single story is dangerous. So throughout the TED Talk, she will be telling us first what a single story is, giving us lots of examples, and then explaining why it's dangerous. And then she ends by telling us what we can do about it with sort of a call to action. How do we fix this problem, this danger of the single story? So she starts by telling us that as she was a child growing up in Nigeria, she read British and American children's books. The characters were white, they talked about snow, they ate food she didn't have access to, they wore clothing and did their hair in ways she did not. And because all the books she read were filled with these white characters, when she first started writing as a young girl, her books were filled with the same things, even though she did not know what they were. She thought that books had to be about foreigners, meaning people not from Nigeria. She thought that books had to be about these things that were unfamiliar to her. But then she mentions finding African authors when she was a little older. She mentions the author Kamara Ladd. I have one of his books right here, The Dark Child. And then she mentions Chinua Achebe, who you will read in 10th grade. And she says that African literature saved her from having a single story of what books are. And that's really powerful when we think of this idea that representation matters, because when she was a child, all of her books that she was exposed to were filled with white characters, were filled with people she couldn't really relate to that closely. And so she thought that books couldn't be about people like her. But once she realized they could, it empowered her, and she became the author that she is. And she wrote this novel featuring a character who is like her, not her, but like her. And it's because she was exposed to literature featuring characters that she could relate to. So this idea that representation matters is very powerful, and it ties into her argument of the danger of the single story. Now, on your questions, I kind of messed up, and I put this question: what single story did people in America have of Africa? Before the talk about her houseboy. So I'm on the second page of the Jamboard, and I'm going to talk about her houseboy Fide really fast. Now, she mentions quickly in the TED Talk that in Nigeria, it's normal to have live-in domestic help. But children would sometimes go and live with wealthier families to have access to better schools, and then they would do some housework and things in exchange. So she tells the story of her houseboy named Fide, and that he came to her and all she knew that he was poor. Her mother would say things like, finish your food, people like Fide's family don't have this, or, her mother was always using him as an example to make her be grateful. His poverty was her single story of him. And then she talks about going to his family's village, meeting his family, meeting his mother, seeing these beautiful baskets his brother had made, and being shocked that his family was capable of doing these things because all she knew was they were poor. When she thought of them, she just thought of poverty, and that was it. And she was so blinded by this single story, she hadn't realized that she and Fide had much more in common than she thought. She hadn't seen him as a person, essentially. She had just seen him as a poor young boy. She hadn't seen him as a full human being. Then she starts telling us about when she came to America to go to college. She says that her roommate was fascinated by her and was like, how do you speak English so well? Because her roommate didn't realize that English is the official language of Nigeria. She also wanted to listen to tribal music, and Adichie was like, here's my Mariah Carey. She couldn't imagine that Adichie would be intelligent, that she would know how to use things like stoves. She just really had a single story of her. And Adichie says her single story was one of catastrophe. Her default position was one of well-meaning pity. So basically, when people in America think of Africa, they think of poverty, they think of AIDS, they think of war, they think of starving children. And then Adichie didn't fit that. And so her roommate was confused. She elaborates further and talks about a story of a professor who told her her characters were not authentically African because they were educated, they had money, they drove cars. And she's just looking at him like, what? Authentically African, what are you talking about, right? But it's because he had this single story of Africa. And then she goes even further and says, like, she did not think of herself as an African until she came to the US. We have a single story. We put Africa together. It's Africa, but it's a very diverse continent. And she thought of herself as a Nigerian. She was like, I can't represent Africa. I'm Nigerian. But she said she's now grown to kind of accept that and embrace the idea of being African. And she says, if I had not grown up in Nigeria, I too would think Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty, dying of AIDS. So one thing she does throughout this is she gives examples of people who have believed single stories about her, but she also gives examples of her believing single stories. She's showing that this doesn't mean that you're bad or evil. It's something that happens to everybody, but it's something we need to fight against. She tells a story of when she came to America, falling prey to a single story of Mexicans, seeing them only as abject immigrants, impoverished, trying to trick their way into the United States, because that's kind of what she saw in the media. And then she talks about going to Guadalajara and realizing she was wrong and feeling ashamed. So at this point, she defines what a single story is. She says, show a people as one thing and only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. So when all the headlines talk about Mexicans trying to get into the US, trying to trick, scamming, doing all this, that is what they become to people. Hold on just a second. Sorry, I had a brief interruption from a child. So she says, show people as one thing and only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. She used the example of the coverage of Mexican immigrants. Also, her houseboy and how her mother would always use him as an example of his family's poor, don't take this for granted. And so when you repeat just this one tiny part of a person over and over again, that's what people start believing. And she talks about how power has a role in this. You have to have power in order to create a single story. It's the ability not just to tell a story of another person, but to make it the definitive story. So that's why, like, her mother was able to create a single story because she believed her mother. Her mother had a role of authority. The media, news organizations are able to create a single story because people see them as authorities. People trust and respect them. When someone like the president keeps saying things over and over again, it can create a single story for people who believe him, for his followers, people who are loyal to him, because he has that power. People respect him. People believe him. So power has a role in this. So essentially, a single story is an incomplete story plus the power to make people believe it. So what is she talking about? Like, what could we say instead of single story? Well, it's related to stereotypes. She does say the single story creates stereotypes, and it's like a bias. It's like a skewed perspective, seeing something one way and then forcing that view on others. So the danger of a single story, right? That's the name of this TED Talk. So what is dangerous about it? Well, she says a single story can become the definitive story and it can impact how we interact with each other. She says the problem is that it's not untrue, but it's incomplete. And its incompleteness robs people of their dignity. It takes someone who is hardworking and has ambition and just boils them down to being poor. It takes people who are trying to do their best for their families, who are ambitious, who have goals, who have desires, who have great skills, and just boils them down to like, okay, here's the situation in their country and they want to leave, and they're tricking people. It robs people of their dignity. And it does so by emphasizing how we are different and not how we are similar. So it basically turns people into something different. You're a person, you're this way, these people are other. They're different from us. And once you make someone an other, or you make someone, you focus on their differences, it makes it hard to recognize our shared humanity. It makes it hard to empathize with them. It makes it hard to understand them. It makes them bad. It makes them evil. It makes them, all these negative things. And it's much easier for people to react negatively to someone that they've decided is bad, is a criminal, is other. And she says that, some of these negative stories about Africa, some of the poverty, some of the wars, they are part of her experience. But to make those her whole story, to insist that only the negative stories matter when it comes to her, flattens her experience. And it overlooks everything else. It gives a compressed and incomplete view of her. And so she shares a quote or a phrase from Chinua Achebe, one of the African authors, the author of Things Fall Apart. And she says, what we need is a balance of stories. Stories need to be balanced. They need to be complete. There needs to be multiple views, not a single story. All right, I put some quotes in here that you can go back and look at if you want, that I thought were pretty significant. But the biggest one is that when she says stories matter, many stories matter. And that's what I want us to keep in mind as we read Purple Hibiscus. She wrote this book because she thought the story mattered, okay? But why? Why does this story matter? What is she trying to tell us? What is she trying to teach us? She's writing a book, a specifically like Nigerian novel filled with Nigerian characters. And what are we reading this as Americans meant to learn? What is the idea? Like giving us this fuller picture of life in Africa. What are we meant to take away from that? How can this impact us? What can we learn from it? Just some things to consider as we read. And we connected the ideas in the single story back to the article we read about T.I., how this article was very one-sided, just presented T.I. as belligerent, drunk, someone who had been in prison, someone who had had problems with law enforcement. And the dangerousness to that story was that if people don't know T.I., they just now have a very negative image of him, which, okay, like T.I. is one person, why does that matter? Well, T.I. being a rapper that many people recognize by name, when you make T.I. this negative figure, now that can be extended to the whole of rappers, and rappers are like dangerous, drunks, criminals. And then we can take it even further, and people will take some of these stereotypes and apply them to Black men. And when we look at how Black men are often portrayed in our media, we see this single story. And it's important to recognize these single stories when we see them, because people often think of news organizations as objective. They have power, right? They have authority. They're telling the truth. But the problem is they're not always. They sometimes will give a very one-sided story, and that causes problems. Presenting T.I. as a belligerent, dangerous, angry man furthers a racist narrative that is prevalent in our country. And when we see things like this, we need to call them out. We need to draw attention to them so that it stops. And finally, just some ideas about representation matters. We talked about how seeing people like her in books helped make her feel empowered, feeling like she could write, feeling like she was worthy of being written about. And it's been proven that people benefit from seeing and hearing people they can relate to. And this means we need representation from diverse races, ages, genders, nationalities, ethnicities. And just some other points that were made in class is that in our country, we've had 45 presidents and 44 of them have been white men. And this really sends a message about who we see as leaders, who has the power in our country. If you are interested more in these ideas, I suggest reading Toni Morrison. She has written about the other and the consequence of creating others in literature. And if you want to know more about this, talk to me. I can point you to lots of things to read. But the idea is this is why it's so important that we have diversity in our media, because we need to, number one, empower people, show them that all types of people can be successful, but also we need exposure to people who aren't just like us, because if we only surround ourselves with people like us, then we start to create a single story about people who are different, and that's when you create this idea of the other, and that's when things get really dangerous. So, in conclusion, stories matter. Many stories matter. Be curious. Try to think about things from different perspectives. Try to identify if something has a bias, if a story is missing a perspective, and then consider what perspective is it missing, because there are multiple sides to every story, and just focusing on one side is dangerous.